Good afternoon or good morning. Welcome to today's webinar titled For Portrait Edits. So that's exactly what we are going to be doing. I say we as in the past. I've been joined by my colleague Alex. So I'm the guy at the top, David, part of the software sales team based out of Copenhagen in Denmark. And Alex hopefully should be there as well if he hasn't died of heat exhaustion.
Hello.
Yes, having a mini heat wave in Denmark, which no one is used to at all. So
No.
we're taking it in turns again today. So I'm going to do a couple of edits and Alex is going to do a couple of edits as well. As usual, we have 60 minutes maximum, but today's subject we can wrap up a little bit quicker. It only took us 45 minutes, I think, earlier today,
Yeah,
so that's what
how
we're
about that?
aim for today as well, I think. All being well. We are recording the session too, so don't worry if you don't catch anything or you get a little minor screen freeze or something like that. You can watch it on our Learning Hub as of tomorrow. You are very welcome and encouraged to ask questions throughout. So if you're on your Mac or PC, the last box on your GoToWebinar control panel, you can ask a question there. If you are on your iOS device or Android device, you can press the question mark icon and ask a question in the same way. Okay, so I think that is time for us to begin. So if we come out of Keynote, then you should be able to see Capture One on screen. So these are the images we're going to work with. So I'm going to go for, first of all, this Indian sort of wedding shot at the top from Eric Ronald in Australia. And I'm also going to take this image down here on the right-hand side from Chris Davies in the UK. And Alex is going to use a couple of his shots. So this one here, the black and white conversion, and the studio shot down here as well. So all of them use kind of slightly different techniques. So we're not just going to do the same thing on each one. We've kind of picked these so we can show you various different methods. All right, so first one, as I said here, so this is the image as it comes out of camera, as you can see on screen now. And what we're going to do with this one is perhaps use clarity in a slightly unconventional way, just to sort of soften the image slightly, but not make it look, blurry or out of focus or anything like that. So we're going to try and get to a result which is something along the lines of this. So back to the original. First thing to do, I'm just going to straighten it a little bit. And for this method in the rotation tool, I find it easier just to highlight the value box, and then I just use Shift and my up cursor key just to rotate, because then I can jog and shuttle back a bit just to tweak the rotation without really having to drag the slider. And I find that more accurate than pulling a slide around if it just needs, a small tweak. Now this is the image with kind of zero adjustment. So I'm just going to pull in the highlights on my level slider like so. And you can see generally it's actually a pretty fantastic image as it was delivered into Capture One. But now to the clarity side of things. So down here in our clarity tool, traditionally we use clarity for, if you like, increasing contrast, but clarity only works in the midtones. So it doesn't block up our shadows and it doesn't ruin our highlights. But we can also use it in the negative fashion as well. So if we grab this and take this down to around minus 50 odd and then structure down to minus 10, and if I option click or alt click on my reset button, then you can see before and then after. So it just has a slight softening effect, but it doesn't look, blurry or horrid or anything like that. It just takes the edge off the sharpness, if you like. Also with this one, if we look in our noise reduction tool, and a little fact about Capture One, you'll always see 50, 50, 50 here for the 3 noise reduction parameters. But depending on your camera model, they might be doing something a little bit different under the hood, because our default noise reduction is going to vary based on the camera model and also the ISO of the particular camera as well. So 50-50-50 is, if you like, is the 0 starting point. And if I click on the three dots here, you'll see Save as Defaults for Canon EOS 5D Mark III in this case. So if I wanted different defaults, if I felt the noise reduction was too much or too little, then I could change it here. But in this case, I'll just bump up the noise reduction a bit more, just to help clean up the noise a bit, and then take the details down, which is also going to have an additional sort of softening effect as well. But once again, it's not going to make it look unattractive or unsharp, for example. One thing we can see here might be hard for you to see on the webinar stream. So let's go to 200%, like so. So you see we've got some little spots here, very easy to remove with our spot removal tool. Now there's two settings, spot and dust. So dust is, if you like, an actual blemish on your sensor. Spot is a mark on the subject itself. So with the spot cursor tool selected, I can just zap these little bits where the makeup has just, if you like, crumbled from the top. If you want to adjust the size of a spot, you can just enlarge it and shrink it just by grabbing the edge. And we've got a little spot there, and then maybe just a blemish there. That's a facial feature, I think, so we'll leave that, but we can just get rid of that one. And there. See, really sort of quick and easy. Didn't take me very long just to sort that out, but do remember to use the right type. So Dust Manuel is asking dust if it's dirt or a mark on the sensor of the camera. So if you've changed lenses and you've got a load of dust in your camera body and it shows up on the image, that's when you want to use dust. Okay, so how are we looking so far? I mean, we've only done a couple of minor things and it looks super nice. If I long press on the reset here with my Alt key, you can see before and after. Let's actually zoom into 100%. So that's before and after. And let's pop on a little style. So we've got some of our Capture One styles here from our new pack Sunbound. So I'm going to just probably choose maybe this one, Anger Watt. But it's a little bit too strong, if you like. I just want a subtle effect. So don't forget, since Capture One, what was it, Alex? 11.1, I think?
Yeah, it was 11.1.
One that we can right click and say apply to new layer. So if I do that, and then we look here, you see I've got my style on the layer. So basically that's now a local adjustment. If I press M on my keyboard, you can see it's basically a mask on the whole area. But if I want to take the edge off it a bit or just reduce the impact of the style, I can just go from 0, which is no style, all the way up to 100, the full impact. So I'm going to choose something around there. Now this style has a little bit of clarity and structure in it. I don't want it to counteract what we did earlier, so I just reset that. And a little bit of vignetting, like so, maybe a touch more shadow recovery, and then I think I'm pretty happy. So if I zoom in to 100% again, like so, Alt click again on the reset, that was before and after, like so. So what we could also do, I'll just make a new variant of this. And let's put them next to each other. Shift click on the big head over here, that will zoom them both to 100%. And then you can see it's still nice and sharp, but it's just got the edge off the sharpness on the skin pores and so on. So it doesn't look out of focus. We've done a little bit of a cleanup. We've applied our style as a layer, and then just reduce the opacity a bit so it just takes the edge off that particular style. And away we go. Now that took me 5 minutes. So an edit like that you could do at home in 1 or 2 minutes without having to explain all the steps basically. Any questions there, Alex?
Oh, just one from Luciano. Why didn't you apply
Luciano.
clarity to a local adjustment or layer? And I mean, I guess that's perfectly doable as well? So you can just
Yeah,
only
I
apply
think
to the skin.
I think we could have brushed the negative clarity in as a layer, but it has actually quite a nice effect. If I option click again, it sort of has quite a nice softening effect on other areas too. So, but yeah, we could easily make that on a layer and just apply it to the skin if we wanted to. But I think that would be making extra work here as well. So we use the clarity tool instead of the brightness slider. Manuel was asking. So brightness is like a mid-tone bump. So clarity is a mid-tone contrast adjustment. So they're two very, very different things. Just happens to be that negative clarity also has that softening effect. So let's go to the next one. So we have our handsome man here. So let's just reset. Oh, it's reset because it's grayed out. Fit on the screen, good. So we've got our chap here who looks, again, pretty good out of the camera. But this little exercise is going to be about using contrast, setting the levels, and more importantly, using a luminosity curve. But before we get to that, let's grab our straighten tool. I'm going to use the fence or whatever it is next to him as a reference and press C on my keyboard to get to my crop tool and then just crop this down to something like this. So that's our first cropping and straightening done. Again, always worth having a look at the levels over here. I don't want to pull the highlights in because that's probably going to lose a bit too much detail up here. We can always check with our exposure warning. So I'm going to leave the highlights where they are, but I am going to pull the shadows in just so we get a bit more contrast. And generally when you're working with contrast on a person, male, female, or whatever, it often makes sense to not use an RGB curve, but to use a Luma curve. Why? Well, let's first do a quick bog standard RGB sort of S-curve. So we've added a bit more contrast, but also you're always going to get a color shift with an RGB curve. So you see his skin tone saturation has jumped up a fair bit. The saturation on his jacket has jumped up a little bit as well. So it's kind of sometimes an unwanted effect. So let's reset that and go to Luma and throw in a similar kind of curve like that. So you see now we've got our added contrast, but saturation stays exactly the same, or I should say the color stays exactly the same. So if you felt you've nailed the skin tone, but you just want to play around with the curve a little bit, then Luma Curve is your friend in that respect. Now, if you don't understand curves or you feel it's a bit too advanced for you right now, the contrast slider is actually a great compromise between RGB and Luma, kind of somewhere in the middle. So don't feel that you can't use a contrast slider. Works really well, but to give you that ultimate control, Luma Curve is definitely your friend. So we've done that. We could do, let's see, we can just do a quick bit of spotting again. That's very simple. Won't have to do all of them, but you can see you can work, nice and quickly just by picking out those spots like so. It's much easier to adjust the size just by dragging the corner of the circle, edge of the circle, I should say, than trying to use the UI itself. That would be a pretty entertaining circle, wouldn't it? If it had an edge like so. Those spots will disappear. Someone was asking earlier, when the spot tool is selected, the cursor tool, you can also select it up here. You're going to see your spots, but as soon as you, for example, press H to get to the pan tool, they're going to disappear. So that's just a little quick cleanup with him. Now, what we can do with this shot, let's say we're happy with the skin tone and base contrast and so on. What we can do with this is actually treat the jacket quite differently, because conveniently it all happens to be the same color. So let's go to the color editor, down here, Advanced tab always if you can. Choose our color picker, and then we're going to pick on the color tone that we want to edit. So let's click around here. Now, just to be on the safe side, I tend to always turn on View Selected Color Range, and that will dip everything to monochrome, which is not part of my selection. So you see that's a pretty good selection of just the jacket. And to be on the safe side, if we click this little shortcut button down here, that will span the full saturation range of my picked color. So the little dot in the middle of the wedge on the color editor is my picked color, and the saturation range is the edge of the circle to the center, and the range of colors is basically my wedge. So that's done a pretty good selection. So let's turn off View Selected Color Range. So now if I wanted to, I could, brighten his jacket, or I could darken his jacket. We could desaturate him, give him a gray denim jacket if we wanted to. Ooh, very nice, yeah. Oh, and of course change the color of his jacket by tweaking the hue as well. But the whole purpose of getting this selection is that now in the color editor itself, we can create a masked layer from the selection. So the color selection will be converted to a mask. So pretty quickly, as soon as I tap that, let's go to layers, press M on my keyboard. Then you'll see we've got our selection there of just his jacket quite nicely. So now I've got free rein to use any of the other tools that I want to, just to play with his jacket. So for example, in this case, let's just lift the shadows a bit, like so. So we've got independent control, or I could use curves or whatever. But it's really convenient in that situation just to play around with that. Last thing, we're going to use a patented Alex Fluff technique, as it's known, isn't it? So we're going to make a new layer, new empty layer. Call this, let's just double click on that. We call it Alf. It's Alex's initials, Fluff. Just a little technique. We go to the curves and bring up our shadows all the way up here, something like that. Now we're going to grab our local adjustments brush, get a nice soft large brush, something like this. Let's go down fairly low opacity. I might just cut the flow down a bit as well. And then what we can do with a sort of quick tap and so on. But what this allows us to do is just do a little selective lighten. So if I turn off the layer then and turn it back on, just gives us the ability to do a little kind of brighten in the top left-hand corner.
Can you just turn it off and on again?
Yeah, so let's turn it off like so and turn it back on. Just a little tiny subtle flare. And if we wanted to, let's just make it smaller. We could do a similar thing. I'll just see, you can see the effect of it extra strong there, which is too much. So if I undo that, right click, let's take my flow right down even more. Maybe a bit bigger, then we can just tap a couple of times and just brighten up certain areas. So the Alf Fluff technique, as it's known. Joshua was asking, can you use a tablet? Yes, actually using a Wacom as we speak. I find it much easier for actually a lot of things. I mean, drawing masks for sure, and just day-to-day use of dragging sliders and all that kind of stuff. But certainly if you're going to do dodging and burning, which Alex is going to show, then you'll be able to get an idea of when maybe a brush is more useful.
There was a question from Manuel. Can
Yes.
you repeat the difference between contrast, RGB, and Luma Curve?
Luma. Okay, so let's go back to our background layer. So when you play with an RGB curve, you're always going to have some kind of potentially unwanted effect to saturation. sometimes that's okay. But in the case of skin tone, it might be undesirable. So if you're happy with your skin tone and you just want to play with contrast, then you're better off on the Luma Curve because that's purely adjusting contrast. It has no effect to color. So your color is completely stable. Now, sometimes when you play with a Luma Curve, you think, you know what, this looks a bit weird because you're used to, when contrast goes up, to seeing colors being a bit brighter and punchier. For example, on a nice sunny day like it is today, sky looks super blue, grass looks green or burnt and brown in this case, but color saturation is great. Cloudy day, everything looks really super flat. So when you first start playing with Luma, you might find that the results look a bit strange to your eye, but don't forget you've got saturation, so you can always play with saturation independently as well. And then the contrast slider is kind of a little bit of RGB and a little bit of Luma. So it's sort of a really nice compromise between the two. So if I reset this and just use the contrast slider, then I get my boost in contrast, a little bit of increase in saturation, but not as much as an RGB curve. Okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, good. The only other thing I might do with this one, but I'll move over to you, Alex, because I think you're going to do a similar thing, is that we could just brighten the eyes a little bit, just with a small local adjustment tweak. So, shall we go to your two images?
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, good stuff. All right, let's make you the presenter. And then we should be able to see your screen coming up.
There we go. So, all right. The first image I'm gonna show is this one, and it's hopefully gonna end up looking something like this. So just to put them up side by side, so it's gonna be a black and white conversion, and then I'm gonna do some dodge and burn. So let's get started. First of all, as David also did on portraits, I like to crop. So if I select my crop tool up here, right click, I get the aspect ratios, and I kind of like 4:5 for portraits. So let me use that. Grab from the corner, and it instantly snaps to 4:5. Drag it in a bit, and just the top of her hair. There we go. And back to the hand tool. Oh, maybe that was a bit too much. There we go. All right. So since it's going to be a black and white image, the first thing I'm going to do to editing is go to the color tool, the color tab, sorry, over here. Down here we have the black and white tool, and I'm going to enable that. For portraits, I think it's always a good idea to play a bit around with the yellow and the red, because these channels enable you to kind of decide the luminosity of each channel. So taking the yellow down and the red down a bit, but not as much, I think gives kind of a good starting point. So that was it for the black and white tool. Now I'm going to do a bit about the overall contrast and luminosity of the image. But I'm going to do that in a layer. And that is because I can get ultimate control of that when doing it on a layer. And let me show you. So in the Layers tab, I long press the plus sign so I can create a new filled layer. And this is a new layer, and if I click M on my keyboard, you can see that it covers the entire image. And I'm going to put that to 70% opacity from the beginning. And I'll get back to why I do that. So, as David mentioned, you can play with the contrast here. But actually, let me add a bit of contrast there. And for portraits, I also like to decrease exposure and increase brightness. And you might wonder why, but exposure and brightness are a bit different. And if you decrease exposure like this and increase brightness, you get a better control of the highlights of the skin. You can play a bit around with it, but it's always a good idea to mix the two. I'm also going to add some levels, boost the whites a bit here, and take it a bit up to make it a bit darker. There we go. And for curves, I think Luma should be fine. There we go. All right, so that was my, let me rename this one to Luma/contrast. Now I'm gonna do something called dodge and burn. If you're familiar with it in Photoshop, that's great. If not, I'm just gonna quickly go through how you set it up because it's quite easy.
Oh, by the way, we got told off this morning for saying Photoshop and not saying the darkroom. So Photoshop and the darkroom, if you're old enough for that, like me. Yes.
I'm unfortunately not old enough to remember that.
That far back, yeah.
All right, so to do dodge and burn, you make 2 new layers. And these are empty layers opposite of a filled layer like this one. So the first I'm going to call burn. You can also call it darken. And the second I'm going to call dodge. And you can call that brighten or lighten or whatever floats your boat. But if I select the burn layer, I take the RGB curve and drag the curve down like so. This is not going to have any effect yet because I have an empty mask. And opposite for the dodge layer, I'm taking the curve and moving it upwards like so. And now we are ready. So I like to start with the burn because I just think it's nicer to first darken the image where I need more shadow and then apply some highlights afterwards. For some images, actually most images, I end up going back and forth a bit. But for now, this is only going to take maximum 5 minutes, maybe even just 2 minutes. So I'm taking burn and then dodge. All right. I take my brush here, and then if I long press, and right click in here, I get the brush settings. So right now I'm using a mouse, and I want the opacity to be very low when using a mouse, because I need to continuously do like brushes on the same area. If you use a Wacom, you would do it the opposite with flow and opacity. You would take opacity up and flow down. So it kind of works like, how can you say when you spread butter on a piece of bread?
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it. Yep, or painting on a wall. You brush back and forth and you add more paint with each stroke. So that's pretty much what flow is doing, yes.
Yeah, all right. So with the burn layer, you want to darken the already dark areas because I want to add a bit of depth to the face. Because if we see before all adjustments with a global reset up here, you can see that it's a bit flat in this daylight. So what I do now with the burn layer selected is that I start to brush on the already shadow area. And you have to do this. I recommend doing it with a very low opacity so you get optimal control of what you're doing. So the sides of the face like so to give a bit more depth feeling. And up here as well, maybe below here. So this way you can actually kind of airbrush the face and add shadows to shape it. And a bit larger brush, so. And also some on the chin down here or the neck, and some here. Sometimes it's difficult to actually see the result while doing it, but if I just turn off the burn layer, you can see before and after.
Yep, we can definitely see.
So already it's starting to shape up quite nicely. So let me switch to the dodge layer. And no, I think the brush size is okay. So this is the opposite. You want to add light to the face. So you do that like so. Maybe the cheekbones and maybe the middle of the forehead up here. And maybe also actually the shoulder down here, but only in the middle to give like a perception of depth. And you can also add some to the hair to add some glow. Like so. There we go. And back to the burn layer and add some shadows to the hair.
Lars was asking, and we did explain, but I'll while you click away dodging and burning, I'll try again. So Lars was saying, why flow 100? So I mean, there's kind of two alternative ways to do it. I mean, I generally use a Wacom, so I have the flow set very low, so I can sort of continually brush back and forth to build up, the dodge or burn layer. But if you have flow at 100, then you see Alex has a super low opacity, and you might be able to hear his mouse clicking in the background. So it's like a click, drag, click, drag, click, drag, and then you'll gradually build up the dodge or burn layer. Or if you want to scrub, I guess, with a brush or a mouse, then it's best to have a lower flow and a higher opacity, so you can just kind of draw if you like. But both techniques end up with the same result. It's just basically how you prefer to do it.
Yeah.
So
All
hope
right.
that helps, Lars. Yeah.
I'm just going to double click and get the spot tool, just as you showed on the first one. Couple of tiny spots. I think the model, Alex, she actually kept it super natural. I don't even know if she has makeup on this shot.
Well, it's pretty good skin.
Yep. All right, so if I remove the layers, oh, my computer is very warm right now.
It's still working, so we can still see you, don't worry.
Okay, great. So if I option click layers, you can see before Luma contrast and dodge burn and after. So it's quite a difference that you can make using this technique. Yeah? I think that was it for this image, unless there are any questions.
Yeah, Richard was asking, because you said you'd come back to it, why did you set the Luma contrast layer to 70%?
Good catch. Sorry about
Good
that.
catch.
So the reason is that this Luma and contrast is now a mix of different tools. So it's both exposure and its levels and its curves. But if I want to boost or decrease that effect, I mean, decrease is easy. You can do that from 100 as well. But let's say I want that effect to be just a bit more, then I have the extra 30%. So I can boost that effect easily by simply dragging the opacity. So that's the reason to starting at a lower point than 100. Yeah. So before and after. Quite a dramatic change, I think.
Definitely, and it's a really nifty technique that you can use on all kinds of things. Whenever you're sort of starting with an empty layer, if you started at 70% or whatever, it always gives you the ability to tweak either way without having to make a whole bunch of changes if you've got loads of edits on one particular layer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
We love it.
So, next image. This is straight out of camera, actually pretty decent. But I want it to look a bit like this. And this image is going to be about the skin tone and color grading, overall color grading. So first of all, just as the previous image, I'm going to crop it. So select the crop tool. Make sure you have an aspect ratio you like. I think 3:4 for this one, just to mix it up a bit. And there we go. So the very first thing I do might not be always the best thing to start out with, but I'm going to do it for this webinar. It's going to be a skin tone layer. And the reason I'm putting the skin tone adjustments on a layer is that the skin tone tool that I'm going to use will affect a hue range of colors, and the hair is kind of the same hue as the skin, and I don't want to affect the hair. So I just want to brush in the skin. So that's the reason for the layer. So within the color editor on this layer, you go to skin tone, and then take the skin tone picker and select a color in here. Then you get the color range, and now you're ready to tweak it. So just as the advanced color editor, the skin tone tool has hue, saturation, and lightness amount. If you change amount, that means that you affect this area of colors with whatever you're doing here. But the extra stuff is uniformity, because if I drag hue all the way up to 100, oh, completely forgot, I have to brush in, otherwise it's gonna make no difference
Difference
at all
whatsoever. Yeah.
So let me just do that, and I'm gonna remove the lips and the eyes from the mask, but I've found it to be easier, instead of trying to drag around it, that I instead just drag or draw over it and then remove it afterwards. I think that's faster. Are we still live?
Yeah. There was a little momentary glitch. But let's see. I think, yeah, I can see you removing away. So probably when you zoom out, if anyone else has an issue, it should unfreeze. So don't worry, Alan and Manuel. Let's see. It's funny. It's there's a new go-to webinar coming in September. So let's hope there are little glitches that seem to interfere with our cursor, if you like, goes away.
Okay.
So
Are
screen's
we
good
back
for
online?
me. So yeah, we're good, I think, as far as I can
Great.
tell. Yeah.
All right. I'm gonna hide the mask, and now I can drag the uniformity. So if I do that, it might be hard to see on the GoToWebinar screen, but the uniformity of the colors, or the colors were drawn towards the center, this little dot. And just to show exactly what it does is that all these colors within this wedge will, like a black hole, gravitate towards the dot. So if I move the dot, let's say to the red, you can see that the skin gets kind of pink. And if I move the dot up towards the green, she turns into Shrek. So let's move it back to something neutral, like so. So that's what hue uniformity does. Saturation uniformity, if I drag that up a bit, will even out different saturation levels on the skin. And it's dangerous to pull it all the way up to like 90 or 100, because then the skin might start to look a bit unnatural. Let's say you have a bit of a like red cheek, I don't know, blush. And if that disappears, it might look a bit sad compared to having this blush. Lightness, that's super, it's dangerous, because if you drag that up all the way to 100, it's gonna look like this, and you don't want that.
No,
So
it's
let's
the
keep it-
Instagram skin smoothing effect. Yeah.
Yeah,
So if you want to do that, you can. But yeah, it's just used with caution, I guess.
yes. All right, so I think this is okay. Up here, I can tweak the hue, and if I go one way, it's gonna be a bit more purple. If I go the other way, it's gonna be a bit more warm towards the yellow-greenish tones, and I think this was actually okay. Saturation, take a bit down, but not so she looks pale. And lightness, what do we want to go with? A bit up, I think. There we go. So if I just zoom in to 100%, I can remove the layer and apply it again. So you can see that the skin is all sorts of colors here, and that might be attractive and like natural. This might be a bit too much for some, but it's easier to see in the webinar.
And it's super easy to do that. I mean, anyone can use the uniformity sliders. If you were to attempt to do that in, Photoshop, that actually requires a fair amount of technical skill and knowledge, which I certainly don't have. So if you can do, a rough mask like you saw, and it doesn't have to be blazingly accurate, that's more than adequate. Then it's so easy just to normalize your skin tones.
Yeah. Great. So next one is going to be Luma and contrast, the next thing I'm doing. And I'm going to add a new filled layer, just as with the previous image. And starting with 70, like so.
Grant was impressed that you're naming your layers, but I said it's just for show. It's normally layer 1, 2, 3, yeah?
Yeah, I would love to say that I do this on a daily basis, but let's be honest. Not always. All right, so add some contrast here, add some shadow recovery to the dark areas, and use the Luma Curve, but not too much because it's already quite contrasty. There we go. Should be good. Maybe a bit too much actually. There, I think. And now it's time to color grade. So again, new filled layer, color grading down to 70. And for this, I'm gonna start with the white balance. I'm sorry about my white balance being in the exposure tab, but I use it so often with the other stuff here that I simply drag it out from the color tab and put it back in the exposure tab. But if I drag this down, not too much, there we go, and go to my color tab here, go to color balance, take the shadow and add some teal. In the shadows, there we go, take them down a bit. Midtones, add some warmth, bring those down as well. Highlights, add some teal, but not too much. Bring them up. And I think there we go. So if I just deselect all these layers, so first off with the color grading, off with the luminosity and contrast, and off with skin tone correction. And let me take them back on one by one. So skin tone, Luma and contrast, and color grading. And maybe you think that the color grading is a bit too much. No worries, we can take it down with the opacity, or we can boost it a bit because we started at 70. The same with the Luma and contrast. We can take it down, or we can boost it.
So easy.
Yeah, so it gives you optimal flexibility for doing these kinds of editing. So I think this is it for me now. These two images, I'm done. Unless there are any questions.
We have a couple of questions. Yes, we do. Where is it? Luma or Luma Curve, if you like, versus exposure for dodging and burning. I always tend to use a Luma Curve, but and so do you. So why do we do that?
Yeah, so let me actually clone this variant so I have a new one. If I create a new layer and call it exposure dodge, and another layer and call it curve dodge, let me show you the difference. So exposure dodge, let's say you go +2, and curve dodge, we go up here. So if I take exposure dodge here and start to brush on something that's already white, it's gonna burn out, as you can see, completely burned out down here. So if I just deselect that and go to curve dodge, if I then do the same, it's not gonna burn out in the same way as the curve is up here. It's okay, I went a bit too far there, but maybe
bit too
like so.
Crazy. That's better.
It's gonna protect the highlights as it's gonna fall off here, while if you use exposure, it's not gonna protect any highlights there might be. So let's say you are dodging within the eye, whether there's some white and maybe a reflection or something. If you use a curve for dodge, it's gonna protect those. But if you use exposure, it's gonna maybe blow it out a bit. But it's, of course, completely up to you what you prefer. But that's the difference and why I use the curve.
Yeah, I always seem to think you get a better result. And of course, if you're doing a curve dodge or curve burn, you can really shape the curve to get exactly the sort of look that you want, and you can't do that with the exposure slider. It's just a linear bump across the whole tone range,
Yeah,
so it's
yeah.
really not as clever, if you like. Couple of people, Slyman and sorry if I said your name right, Slyman, yes, and Todd were asking about cheek highlight. If you wanted to knock that back a bit, what would be the best way to do it?
That would be using highlight recovery and maybe the curve as well locally. I wouldn't
Locally,
do
yeah.
it because actually the makeup artist added some glow. You can see on the skin. It actually looks a bit greasy, but it's a typical fashion makeup.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah,
It's one of those contentious subjects, isn't it? Yeah.
yeah.
Let's see. Just looking for the other question. I've lost it. Oh, how would you remove hair on the face of the model? I guess we could do a heel layer, but I guess if there was lots of hair to get rid of, that might be a better Photoshop job.
Yeah,
Yeah.
especially if the hair goes across an eye or something.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
the healing layer is in Capture One is really good and powerful, but it also has limitations if there is a
Yep.
lot of things around it and behind what you're trying to remove.
Yeah, I think that's
Uh,
one of those jobs where we bow to, Photoshop, Affinity Photo, or whatever, to do that more heavy lifting, retouching.
yes.
Yep. And let's see. Um, Elliot said on my edit I mentioned about lightening the eyes, but we didn't do that. How does that work?
Ooh, let me show you. So if I make a new layer, call it eyes, actually take it down to 30% to begin with, and then scroll in. Let me know if, because it seems to be whenever we zoom.
Zoom, that's when, yeah.
So what you want to do is brighten the iris and not the whites.
Yep.
So if I just
Oh, Superman
tweak my
laser
mask,
eyes. Yeah.
yeah, just tweak my mask to just be on the iris, like so. Because really, you have to be careful whitening the white, because it very quickly looks very
Looks
unnatural.
super fake. Yeah.
Alright, so with this, I'm gonna go with curve and all the way up here, and you might think, whoa, that is unnatural. Yes, but if I take a second point down here, take it inwards, ooh, look at that. Nice contrast. And actually take brightness up a bit and saturation down a bit. Maybe that's too much with the brightness. And maybe we actually need, there we go. And take it down a notch. And zoom out. Go, so before and after. Just a
Nice.
little
A little bit. Yep.
punch.
Just to brighten them up a bit. Definitely.
Yeah.
Or if someone has a very specific color eyes, you could always use the color editor. Like a
Yeah.
blue-eyed person, pick the blue in their eyes on a layer, and then brighten that up. For example, that could also work. There's, I guess, loads of different techniques, but a
Yeah, you
small
could add
local
some
mask,
color balance or.
yeah, color balance too. You could play around with all kinds of stuff. Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, oh, Todd, who was asking about the highlight removal on the cheek. So basically, Todd, what you would do, you would just brush a mask on the cheek itself and then use in the high dynamic range tool if you just want to crack that open, Alex.
Actually, let's try another thing. Sorry to interrupt.
That's all right.
So let's call it cheek highlight.
Yep.
And I didn't make it very clear, but I made a heal layer instead of a normal layer. So if I select a brush around here, set my source to down here, and brush up here, and don't worry about that, it's going to be okay when I release. Go. And then it looks super flat, but you have opacity for healing layers as well.
Just take that back a bit.
So if I take that down, you can actually see that you can completely control the highlight of the cheek, like so.
There we go, Todd. So that's another technique as well. Or you can use that for bags under the eyes and all kinds of stuff. But yeah, it tends to be better on a lower opacity. Otherwise, it's too obvious. What was I going to ask you? I think that was it, actually.
Great. So you can grab back the screen.
Yes. I'm going to grab back the screen just to show you two things, actually. Not image stuff. Let's just make myself the presenter. Show my screen. Okay, so that wasn't what I wanted to show you, first of all. Let's just come out of that and bring in a good old web browser, because Alex has been working very hard on curating this, which if you can't see it, it's very easy to remember, which is learn.phase1.com. So you should all be able to remember that. And rather than having to sort of stumble around YouTube trying to find stuff, if you go to learn.phase1.com, look on the right-hand side and think, you know what, I want to know about color editing. So I click this, and then it will sort the videos for you. Or I want to watch tutorials about color editing, then it will filter further. Or I want to read a blog post about color editing, and there we go. So you can filter down to anything you need straight away. So Todd, if you're new to local adjustments, we could clear these filters and say layers, and then we've got all the stuff on layers, and again blog posts, tutorials, or webinars. So really nice to just sort through all that kind of stuff. Way easier than wading through Lightroom as well. And if you want to share something with a friend, you can right click on the filter, copy that link, and then that will take them straight to your filtered selection as well. Or we can type up in here sessions, for example, and then that will take me to all the various different stuff about sessions. So much better than working with YouTube, much easier to find stuff. And also, if we go into Capture One, don't forget under Help, you've got the Resource Hub, and that will open up a little pop-up window. And again, if you go to tutorials here, you'll see the latest ones. And again, more tutorials. If you've forgotten the various different links, then it should take you to the Learning Hub. So I'm not sure why it didn't. It was working earlier, but these links should take you to the Learning Hub too. But I'm sure you can all remember learn.phase1.com. Alrighty, and the other part I wanted to mention, next webinar, it's not next week, it's August the 9th, and it's not an editing webinar, but it's about process recipes. So if you haven't really got to grips with process recipes, you should. Why? Because it will save you lots of time, and basically you can design a process recipe which will give you a repeatable and consistent output, whether that's for going to web, or print, or final format for retouching, or whatever. If any of you are subscribers to our newsletter and you got an offer from L-Type, the printing company, ltype.com, I'd thoroughly recommend them if you want a really nice set of portfolio prints. Then the last tutorial that we did this week is about preparing images for print. So really, it's well worth spending 45 minutes learning process recipes, because you'll save that in very little time once you get to grips around them. Alrighty. Anything else for you, Alex?
No, just a bunch of great comments about the Learning Hub.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, it's great that you find it useful. So go in and click around.
Yeah, And Alan says, will the webinar be posted in the Learning Hub? Yes, absolutely. So probably, I guess we can, all being well and the stars align, we'll get it up there tomorrow sometime. So, okay. All right. Thanks a lot for your time, ladies and gentlemen. And we hope to see you all soon. Take care.